So, Berto, I asked you to watch the new Teal Swan documentary. I thought we would do a deep dive on that today. What do you say?
I think it's a great idea. Let's do it.
This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Hanna. I'm a therapist and a professor. Who are you, Berto?
My name is Humberto Castañeda, and I build plastic sheds.
When I first saw this documentary, people were asking me to watch it, lots of emails. For our episode, I would look into her life, other things about her outside of the documentary.
The Pandora's box opened.
Yes.
Yep.
So this rabbit hole opens up and I get sucked into the vortex.
Yeah.
I've consumed so many different things, other documentaries, other podcasts, other videos that she's made.
The same thing happened to me, for the record.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
So just so much to say. I didn't realize there would be so much to say because, you know, we've covered a lot of cults.
Yeah.
NXIVM.
Absolutely.
But with Teal Swan, there's so much material that is available to comment on, you know?
It was surprising. First of all, before you asked me, I don't think I'd heard of her name.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of her. Yeah.
I was actually really puzzled by it because on the one hand, it was not like a normal documentary where they lay out background information. And
Right.
So I'm like, I'm jumped in the middle of something.
Yeah.
So then I started looking up and then, it was rabbit hole all the way.
Right.
Rabbits all the way down.
Yeah. Because the documentary was and I've listened to some interviews with the documentary maker, and he says that he was wanting to make something different, and it's his style of documentaries is to not have talking heads, to not do background, to just dive in to the subject, film the subject, and edit it and publish it.
Yeah.
To get not only a feeling for what it would be like to be on the inside, but also to avoid pulling you out by having outsiders commenting on it, this sort of thing. I thought it was effective in that way, but I found myself at the end thinking, well, what are the answers? There's no detail. There's no criticism. I mean, there was the private investigator, but there's only things that are alluded to. So I think that the documentary on Hulu, it's called The Deep End, is a really good introduction maybe, or a companion piece, especially to this podcast called The Gateway.
Right.
I think with those two, you're going to get a lot. And if you watch a couple of her videos on YouTube, I think. But yeah, there's so much to talk about because one, cults are kind of interesting. And you and I have been for over a decade evaluating cults.
You would think they would run out, like we wouldn't be able to talk about it anymore.
Yeah. Not only about cult stuff, but also about personality stuff, because the documentary in particular gives you a behind the scenes look at who the real person is. Because when you see these other documentaries, they don't have what seems to be an authentic look at the leader.
Yep.
It's stuff from afar, or the leader knows that they're on camera, that kind of thing.
Right.
Also, psychology and psychotherapy and suicide. There's so much that I know about that.
Right.
We've also talked about Landmark, which, I don't know if you would call it a cult, but it has a lot of elements with this. But anyway, so from the onset, I just want to say, because I know a lot of people will be watching this that will be for and against and neutral to Teal Swan, which is that my initial conclusion, hypothesis on the point of the rabbit hole that I'm down right now is that there are some concerns regarding cult-like issues, cult-like control, cult-like attitudes and elements, and some criteria being met, but not others. There are concerns about her approach to suicide, but it's unclear if she actually is harming people. And suicide is a really hard thing to help people with. And in my field, there's a fair amount of licensed, qualified clinicians who are pretty bad at it. So I don't know. And we would have to have data and a research study to look at how many people actually come to her and how many people attempt and complete, and compare that to how many people come to people like me. And we would have to compare those two to see if whatever she's doing is either the same or worse. So I'm going to do a full investigation on that in terms of her videos and what people are saying about her. But I will say that the overall criticism of her, some of it is probably valid. But at this point, I think she's clearly helping a lot of people. And I think she's probably harming some people as well. And so I'm kind of somewhere in the middle at this point of the rabbit hole. She's doing a lot of things that a lot of typical religious gurus will do, new agey types of people, and even therapists.
Yep.
And she's even doing a lot of things that are very commonplace in psychological help. also there are some cult-like characteristics that we'll get into. She has some indications of a personality issue.
Yeah.
But the way that people are talking about her, that she's a psychopathic, narcissistic, cult leader who's abusing people, you can make an argument for that. But I just feel like it's complicated is the thing, because there's a lot of people that are really benefiting from it. And there's a fair amount of autonomy, particularly from the followers, and I think even within the inner circle, because Blake was able to leave, right? And so there were consequences. So it's on the spectrum.
It's on the spectrum. If you were grading this on the cult spectrum, it's on there.
Yeah.
I would agree with you. That was my impression, not only from the documentary. In fact, when I just watched the documentary, I was a lot more thinking like, okay, this is really concerning.
Right.
As I watched more content, my concern shifted to the way it would shift with any charlatan.
Or any self-helpy person like Tony Robbins, these kinds of people.
I listened to, I don't know, countless hours of Tony Robbins, probably 15 years ago. I just kind of went deep,
Because you liked him, or?
Yeah. At the time I did. And I just consumed a ton of it. I never had a feeling of magic. Yes, there were things like you got to visualize what you want. There was no magic. There was no like, I'm going to touch your face. Now that might have crept in after I used to listen to him.
Didn't you do hypnotism and stuff? Or am I,
none of the stuff I listened to was that.
Okay.
All of it was just.
I have to admit, my sole experience with Tony Robbins was at the beginning of the movie Shallow Hal.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, I will say this.
Literally, that's all I know about Tony
And he
Robbins.
might do that. And maybe it's increased over the years. With this, I immediately got that sense of like, oh, I see there's magic. And then when you start hearing her talk about herself and stuff, it's like, oh, okay, she can see other dimensions, other interdimensional. And so there is magic in her thing, which is why I immediately thought, I see. Yeah, okay. I would have the same problem with, anyone discussing their methods that rely on magic. But I started, to what you're saying, I started feeling less like this is a priority zero cult we must stop today.
Yeah.
And by the way, I found it very fascinating that they agreed to it and then seemingly had scenes that weren't really edited for camera. There were scenes where I'm like, you're okay with me watching this?
Right.
You're not looking great here, but
right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's another interesting element about it that I was thinking was, so you're okay? The cameras are there.
Yeah.
Teal, I'm thinking, Teal Swan, you're cool with what you just did being presented on camera.
Yeah, because it didn't seem, like you said, to be like, oh, right, I'm being filmed. So, like kind of evened out, made it a little more vanilla flavored.
Yeah.
Some pretty extreme moments.
Yeah, and embarrassing moments for her that if it was someone else, I would think, well, they're probably okay with seeing the rough side of their personality. Yeah. I don't know if Teal Swan's one of those people who is okay with that, given the way she talks about herself. So if you're interested in the documentary, I would watch it. There's two main storylines. One is that Blake is the second in command. He is the helper, the first worshiper of Teal, or the first follower, I guess. And he falls in love with this woman from Germany, Julia, and Blake and Julia decide at the very end of the documentary to move away because of the conflict between Teal and Blake. Because Blake and Teal Swan had a relationship a long time ago. He's always been her main follower. And
she sort of felt, or alluded to having felt, like he sort of saved her in the beginning.
Right. When she was 19 and she was trying to emerge out of her traumatic background that she claims. More on that later. And then he falls in love with someone, and then the woman comes from Germany to come into the inner circle, and Teal Swan and starts to target Juliana with a lot of anger and criticism and paranoia.
That very first scene, where it's a scene where they're saying, hey, listen, just if you're going to be here, caveat emptor, it's going to be difficult. There's a lot of rules and things. And surprisingly, Julia is like, yeah, no, I get it. Now, she clearly didn't get it, but she was trying to go along with it.
She seemed really into it.
And immediately, Teal Swan, just without missing a beat, goes, we're terrified. And she catches it off guard, like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's like, wow.
Well, what do you think was going on there?
Well, I mean, my sense that I got is like, Teal was okay not having a romantic relationship with him as long as he also didn't have another romantic relationship.
Yeah.
It's like, she wants the adoration, she wants the ownership. And look, I can relate from a certain angle, like, for example, that feeling of when I've had friends that are females that we have sort of a flirty relationship with, usually when they get in a serious relationship, we stop talking.
Yeah.
And I always feel sad and, kind of like I wish that didn't happen. But this is that taken to like the nth degree, right? It's I'm going to sabotage your relationship.
Yeah.
Because I need you for me, period.
Yeah.
That's what I felt.
Well, what if I told you that Blake has had relationships with other women for long periods of time before Juliana, and there may or may not have been issues with those relationships? What would you think about that?
I mean, they alluded to it, and she alluded that there were problems.
Yeah.
Now, maybe they weren't as severe. Well, clearly not as severe because he never left.
Yeah.
And also, maybe this one had more personality or thought more for herself or whatever, and it seemed to threaten Teal a little bit more, but...
Which seems so strange to me because, one, Juliana seems like a very flexible, very nice person.
There's that scene where she's going along with the therapy thing where she's pretending to be a mother.
Not going along, like fully into it.
And so much so that Teal's like, you're doing this better than any of my practitioners.
Yeah. And I was like, wow, like this is going to work, right?
Yeah.
And she moved into the compound. She became a part of the inner circle.
Right. Now, of course, someone could say, well, you didn't see all the scenes or you didn't see all the things.
Right. And so a little bit on that when you were watching it, did you see any evidence of editing manipulation?
Not editing manipulation, but clearly more time was going by. This wasn't a real time account.
Right. So who knows what was really happening?
Yeah. And because there was a lot of claims like, they're all going to see her as like a victim when in reality, she's a monster. I'm paraphrasing, but it's like, those are not the scenes we saw.
Yeah.
But there was also very telling moments. And again, it is on camera, so you don't know. But remember when he's about to leave and she's like, well, if we're going to be being honest with each other, then you're an absolute loser and you'll always be a loser. How about that for reality or whatever?
Yeah.
And then he just looks at her and he says, I love you.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Yeah. That was a snippet of what she was saying to him.
Right. But I felt like in that moment, assuming it isn't like contrived for the camera, which it didn't feel that way. I did get a sense like he was starting to look outside of the box and be like, oh, I see what's happening.
So yeah, well, my interpretation of that was because I've been there before, not in a cult, but in a, let's just say, high control, manipulative relationship in which someone had power over me. The way that I cope with it, I think, is similar to the way Blake was coping with it, which was to internally be upset, but not externally, because at least in my situation, it didn't do any good to externally be upset because it would either go horribly or just badly for me in the end. And was a lot of energy and a lot of emotional outlay, a lot of vulnerability, a lot of unsafety, and in the end, it just wasn't worth it. So when I finally decided to extract myself, I just slowly, with a big smile and I love you, I just backed away. Yeah. Because there's no point in being honest.
He's to me in that moment seemed like he had crossed a good boundary, where he had come to another side of seeing things from a slightly more impartial view and saying, I see. I'm not going to engage.
Right.
And I'm just going to say goodbye. And he was brilliant because it worked. Like, well, it worked in that moment, right? Like later on she was still, but in that moment she was like, okay.
Yeah. And one of the ways in which abusers will keep you engaged, which gives them power over you to continue the ensnarement, is to provoke you to fight with them.
Yeah.
Because they know, as the charismatic, powerful person, that they know how to overpower you in a they know how to outmaneuver you. So you, as the victim, will say, imagine Blake would say something like, well, I don't think I deserve any of this. In fact, I don't think I'm a loser at all. Oh, you don't think you're a loser? Well, let's point to this. Remember that one time?
Yep.
And you just imagine that Blake either imagines or knows that Teal is a master at being able to tear you down in a situation like that.
I've been on both sides of that. I've been that person, like sort of using my I don't know, like my ability to debate or argue to try to, engage someone and engage past the point where they don't want to engage anymore. And
because you know that you're better.
Because I know I'm going to be able to, like, at least for myself, outpoint them.
Right.
But I've also been on the receiving end of that, where it's like, yeah, if I keep going with this won't end. Like, it won't end. No matter what I say, this won't end.
Right. Yeah. So there's no point. And And if you've been slowly but surely pulling away emotionally, by the time you get to that point, you don't even really care.
That's right.
You're like, okay, well, that's great. See ya. I love you.
Yep.
Nice chat.
The thing is, I found myself relating a lot in weird ways to Teal Swan in ways that are both good and bad. And so there were moments where I'm like, oh, geez, I've done stuff like that. And also, oh, wow, I've been victim of stuff like that.
Like what?
Well, like what I was just saying, also related to, she has had success. And as a result, she starts getting very self-righteous about what should be. I have both done that and also felt it done to me, where when things are going well for me, when I'm organized, when I'm doing things great, I start getting kind of like expect the whole world to be like that. And when things are not going that, I'm like get impatient with people and I get accusatory and things like that. And the tables have been turned with me. Like my first year college roommate, things start out great, and then pretty soon they're like, I noticed you didn't like spend enough time on your homework last night or whatever. I'm like, yeah, I know, I was tired. Well, but weren't you going to go running this morning? Yeah, I know, I didn't sleep enough. Like, I'm disappointed. You know, like poke. Like, you know, because this person in that moment was doing, you know, really well, or they had a good schedule, and they started getting very self-righteous. And I remember thinking at the time, oh, I kind of get like that too. But it took me many years to be like, oh yeah, okay. I don't like it when this is done to me. So I probably don't want to do this.
Yeah, it's like an emotional pressure. And, you know, just to put it on the table, very long time ago in the beginning of a relationship, I remember there was this one moment. It might have been the only time it ever happened, really. We've talked about it before, and we won't go into full detail, but it was nothing like a cult leader or anything. But when we were in a band and you wanted to hire that consultant, and I was not really enthusiastic about him. You were like 1,000% enthusiastic about him.
Yeah.
But I didn't have the money to pay for that. I was not in that part of my career where I could, and it wasn't even that much money. I think it was just a couple $100s or something.
Right.
And I couldn't afford it. And so I was like, okay, you know, I'll pay for some of it, but I don't want to, and we'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
And I just felt like he wasn't that helpful. And really, I also didn't really care because I didn't want to necessarily be super famous as
Sure.
a band. And even if he did, quote unquote, help us to become more famous, I'm like, well, I don't even know if I'm at that point in my life. And I remember telling you that you had already kind of agreed to hire him more or something. And I was like, yeah, I don't want you. And I remember being on the phone with you, and I remember you just started coming at me with that energy of pressure and coercion and very subtle anger. Like if you were just watching you talk, no one would think you were angry, but I felt the hostility. Oh. And I remember my heart started racing while I was on the phone, and I was just like,
well, and we've talked about this before, although I can't remember the interaction first person now. I know we had it because obviously we did. And I remember the person, I remember all that stuff. I don't remember the call, but I fully buy your account because what was happening as well at the time, and we've certainly talked about this, is I was migrating away from a prior way of being, which is I would always just pay for everything at all times and take on the cost of everything. And I was probably projecting onto you anger about my past situation, going like, God damn it, you got to pull your strings too, you know?
Yeah, that you had been used before.
Yeah, exactly.
Even though I was pretty clear from the beginning, this was not what I wanted to do.
It was but it is true that that was sort of an example of that. And then what I've had is like at work or in like with my wife and with other people too. I have felt at times, I try not to do it anymore, but I probably still do it sometimes. This sense of like, oh, okay, I'm really organized. Everything's going really well. And I'm following through on everything I need to. Why are you not pulling it? Right. Why are you not doing this? Yeah. Weren't you going to do this? And I think I'm just like pulling us up, you know, let's do it. Yeah. But I'm in the process making everyone, stop it, dude. Like, what are you doing? Yeah. And then when it's done to me, I don't like it.
Yeah.
Which makes sense.
I mean, I saw and have seen you, I haven't seen you do it in years and years. I mean, we're talking about 2006 or something.
Right.
And I remember you doing stuff like this to your wife back then too. And I'd just be like,
Mommy and Daddy are yelling at me. No, but
I mean, she seems fine with it. I mean, I don't think she digs it, but she didn't seem to be a wilting flower in the situation. But
no, in fact, that was sort of what over the years, like you run up against the same wall enough and you start asking yourself, like, is it the wall or is it my head? Like, yeah. But I saw some of that in this documentary where she's in charge of this big operation and like everyone needs to conform and everyone needs to do, you know.
And when anyone gets when everything's going smooth, everything's fine. But if someone presents a barrier then you would get this very calm, emulative of what you were talking about, what you would do, but not anything, you were not anything close to Teal Swan, but, in that category where it's calm, but targeted and powerful, dominant, sure of herself, and using the crowd to kind of tear down the person.
oh yeah. Yes.
To I don't know if I want to say humiliate, but and the silence from the group, because I kept wondering, like, are the other group members,
are they on board with this,
or they just don't know what to say?
Yeah.
And with the silence, it just makes the leader seem like everyone is for them because they're not opposing her.
And there were moments where it was clear that whether they really wanted to or not, they were siding with her and but even in a lot of those moments, I still kept feeling ambivalent. There were some times where someone would say something very strident and push back strongly against her. And I would have maybe expected a cult leader to anger out and, well, you're out of the church, whatever.
Right.
I was at first quite impressed with I'm surprised you feel that way.
How long did you feel that way?
Probably after the second interaction, I was like, oh, I see.
Within seconds, I thought, oh, I get it.
No, because I'm still coming at it from like a layman's perspective, right? I'm not analyzing it like, well, what should a therapist do or something? I'm thinking of it like, I am in charge of people and I'm trying to change their lives. How do I motivate them? Well, maybe I'm okay. And this is something, again, things that I can relate to. I can sometimes sit there and you can tell me very shocking things and I can be like, oh, okay. And that is something that is useful to me at times, right? Because as an example, in my job, there are many times where people run in with their heads cut off. Like, they're like, oh my God, the world is burning. We're going to die. And I have to be like, just tell me what's happening. And I have to be the calm and collected.
Well, that's a big difference. Skill. That's a big difference than what we saw in the documentary.
Sure. And but what I was saying is that at first when I saw it, I didn't immediately recognize the passive aggressiveness and the actual venom. A little bit into it, I'm like, oh, I see what's happening. And especially because there's the follow-up scenes where even though she appeared cool, now she's fully vendetta against this person.
Right, yeah. All right, let's take a break. When we get back, more talk.
Let's do it.
Okay, so in the documentary on Hulu, we have the main storyline of Blake, Juliana, and Teal, and that love triangle, if you will. And then the other main storyline is that she's upset, Teal Swan is upset about being accused of running a cult and causing some followers to complete suicide, and she hires an independent private investigator to answer these questions. And so we follow the private investigator as she interviews former members and current members and this kind of thing, and looks over the organization's paperwork, like the non-negotiables and that kind of thing. The thing that I'll say about the editing, just real quick, is that pretty quickly I realized the thing was edited heavily. Like, there were moments where they were doing the stage presentations and someone would come up on stage and they'd say something, Teal Swan would say something that seemed a little questionable, and then immediately they would cut in applause.
Yeah.
And it didn't seem right to me. It seemed manipulative to me. And I don't like that because I think the data is there. You don't have to manufacture things. The other thing that I found out later, and I suspected this was happening as well, is when those group meetings are happening and tension is starting to happen, or some of the procedures, especially with that one person within the pool and that kind of thing. Yeah. All of that, I just had so many questions. I'm like, well, because the way you could easily, if you're against Teal Swan, so let's just talk about the waterboarding incident, that you could very easily conclude, if you don't have a critical viewpoint of it, of the presentation of the documentary, to conclude that you had a group member who was disgruntled about the model and had spent a lot of time and money to get help, and it wasn't working for her. And then you see Teal Swan, at least what they edited in, an approach of ridicule or pressure or blaming her or kind of rejecting her in a sense, being not nice to her.
Seems like a punishment.
Yeah. And also not responding like, oh, I'm sorry. Like, I'm trying and, this doesn't work for everyone. Instead of saying that, in her very common thing that she says on and off camera, and multiple things that I've looked at is, and she literally says multiple times over the years, documented in her words on video, if my model works for everyone, and if it doesn't work, it's their fault. She doesn't say it's their fault, but it'll be some version
Sure.
of that. Like they weren't trying hard enough, or they were resisting, or
Which
they
is
weren't-
the same thing that the death touch martial artists say. Have you seen those
Right.
videos? They literally will say, "Oh yeah, they didn't believe in it. That's
Yeah.
why it didn't work."
right.
It's like that's not a very useful martial art.
Yeah, exactly. And, just imagine if other modes of helping were like that. And I'll say that some in my field will have that kind of excuse. They'll say like, well, that client in psychotherapy, it didn't work for them because they weren't following my recommendations, instead of saying maybe my approach is not helpful.
Look, but there's a difference between saying, "Oh, I had a client that I really tried with, but they just everything I said, they just ignored it, whatever," right? From saying that to my model is infallible unless there's a flaw with the participant. Right?
I've heard that from other therapists.
Yeah, I'm sure you have.
Now,
But
it's
I
not,
bet you-
it's not the standard. It's not what we teach
I don't
them.
hear that from most people, is what I'm saying.
Well.
In life, like in life, you rarely hear that, Like my approach to making this is a soup Nazi kind of thing, right? My soup is infallible. If you don't like it, it's your fault.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So she seems to kind of go after that student, client, I don't know what to call them, participant, follower. And then there seems to be some tension, and then they cut to this scene where they're in a pool and she's being drowned, right?
Yeah.
And she emerges out of the water and she's like in this
I love you.
altered state of mind, and they're, everyone's, gathering around her, and she seems to be in this altered state of emotion, and then she says, "I love you." Okay.
And then the music swells, and
Yeah, and they're like, look at this, what just happened. Like, this is what you get when you oppose Teal Swan. Well, so when I was watching those scenes, I thought there's a lot of editing going on here, and I don't like that. Just show me the scene. Just have a camera in a room, minimal edits, and just show us exactly what happened. Then I learned later from not only Teal Swan, but other followers that were there, and other journalists critiquing the Hulu documentary, that two major details were revealed that I didn't pick up on, of course, because how would I know? One, the pool thing, everyone did that, not just her.
Yeah.
That was what that's a thing that they all, that's like day 2 or something.
Yeah.
They all do the pool thing.
See, I did get that sense during the documentary, which is why I didn't, at the end of that episode, I was like, okay.
Yeah, I don't know what that means. Number 2, she is not the one that says, "I love you." They cut in.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay, that's effed up.
Right?
What?
Yes.
No.
Yes. And if you
Oh.
rewatch it, because the woman came forward, says, "That's me. In fact, look at my outfit. Look at my finger," or something. She identifies
Okay.
like, that's
That's
not
terrible.
That's not the other woman.
That's terrible.
That was me.
That's terrible.
Yes.
See, it's funny because I had this feeling about the documentary. Like I said, when I finished watching it, before I went and watched it, I was like, oh, okay, this is a big problem. But I had this feeling like it wasn't done. Yes, we already said how it's not a conventional documentary. But I also mean that it didn't present enough facts. Like it just showed me a lot of scenes, and the scenes they showed me, most of them made it look bad. Like when I watch a award-winning, really well done documentary like the Enron documentary, that lets you reach your own conclusions, and you don't at the end of the documentary feel manipulated. You do feel shocked by everything you've learned.
Yeah.
And that one's got editing and music and all these things, but there is a difference.
Yeah.
So just learning that, oh man, that's bad.
Yeah.
Oh,
I mean, how do you live with yourself?
that's really bad.
Like, I don't understand how you sleep at night.
It's like the ends don't justify the means.
No, if you're trying to expose something, then you just screwed up because you have invalidated the entire thing. And 2, if you're trying to create some insider honest look at what's going on, so there's only manipulation
Yeah.
and sensationalism is achieved and met through that action.
Yeah.
But 99% of people who watch that documentary won't look more into it.
Yeah.
That'll be that.
Right.
So, that's upsetting. Now, having said that, so at first when I started hearing, well, it looks edited, but oh boy, it looks bad. Then I learned about those details and I was like, oh, is the whole thing a sham? But then I started looking into it more and found that there were some other squirrely things about when Blake left. But generally speaking, the broad strokes are accurate.
Yeah.
Like when Blake is leaving and Teal Swan is berating him verbally
Yeah.
with awful language for no reason. that all happened.
Yeah.
And there is no explanation that makes sense as to why. It's not like he, did something horrible, like killed a puppy, and then she's making, like, he did nothing to deserve it.
I mean, to me, there is an explanation, the mundane one, which is a normal person would be saddened when someone who they've been together in whatever way is leaving and they've had a fight. A person who's on some spectrum of personality disorders might lash out really viciously. But a self-help guru who is supposedly centered and would have all the explanations ahead of them to why that scene happened like that. Like, how is that is that the example that you're trying? That's the worst possible interaction one could hope for in a situation like that.
I know. There's a number of incidents like that where I thought, well, so at the end, I thought, well, whatever following and success she's achieved, it's over now. I mean, just look at that.
Oh, no, come on.
Well, but then I looked more into the actual following of her and what she has been up to, and concluded that not only will this have no effect on her bottom line, but I'm guessing she's going to be 100 times bigger.
Well, just look at the scene following that event where her and her followers, they're not discussing what, like a postmortem of, no, they're tripling down. Okay, we have to have new rules. Like no one can have a relationship.
Right.
Like that's telling, because that means that not only was that tolerated, but now enough events like that happen, that's how you start getting wackier and wackier rules and making it harder and harder to leave.
Totally. And I wonder though about that, because following the suicide recommendations or approach that she's had over the years, rewind the clock 3 or 4 or 5 years, her approach was much more radical and much more controversial, much more problematic. Her approach now is, also, although still problematic, and I'll get into that when I go over at least one video of hers, but it's a lot of the main problems she has excised, seemingly. So she's learning in response to what's happening, which doesn't mean she's not a problem, doesn't mean things won't get worse, but it does potentially mean that she might become more mainstream, like a Tony Robbins, as she appeals to more and more people that aren't looking for that kind of narrow hocus pocus stuff,
That's fair. And one thing that I was thinking about is, look, I actually, because I watched a whole other 2 or 3 videos from her talking about suicide and stuff. And one thing that I thought was, I don't disagree with a lot of what she's saying, about a lot of stuff. But here's one problem, and I had the same problem with the Landmark thing that I went to, is it's one thing to bring in people, have them sign consent forms, explain to them what's going to happen, and carefully guide them through something that might be controversial, whatever. But when you have a room full of, in the Landmark case, it was only like maybe 100 people, a room full of thousands of people attending some big conference, and you're having people testifying on stage about all sorts of things, and then you're saying, of like, visualize this and that. You don't control the experience that directly for those thousands of people, those hundreds of thousands of people. And what that means is that now your burden has to be much higher, your burden of responsibility, because it's like when you put a video out, like your burden of responsibility is pretty high because millions of people could see that video. So I look at it like whether or not a way to talk about suicide is maybe more positive, or maybe a better way to make some progress. That's a fair conversation. When you're having big seminars with lots and lots of people, you can't possibly engage one-on-one with all of these people, and they're walking away from there with uncontrolled new ideas. Like, I think that gets a little more dangerous.
Yeah, well, so this is a broader question that I plan on doing a lot of deep diving on, which is she doing therapy without a license, and is she liable or neglectful or potentially could be held responsible for any bad thing that could happen to a follower if they follow her advice? And at first glance, the answer is, well, obviously, the thing she says she can treat panic and suicide, these are not things that are in the self-help arena. And
that she's uniquely qualified to do it.
Yeah, but at the very least, she's saying that she's qualified. And the added element of no one else, as you're saying, can help you with that, and thus you shouldn't even go to those people because they're not going to help you, which is a very irresponsible thing to say.
It's a bit of that Scientology angle, like psychology, psychotherapy, psychiatry is all bad.
Yeah, in Scientology, they do things that are very, and so just another little caveat to all this is Teal Swan's approach is extremely mundane. I have looked into and been aware of people in her arena for 30 years. She is doing nothing new. I don't see a single thing that she's doing that is unique to her. Yeah. Even the things she claims about herself, about being a multidimensional alien. And I mean, it's run of the mill. It is, I'm not saying it's dumb or wrong or something. I'm saying it's a very common presentation around the world. Really.
And which is, by the way, that's why I was saying that when I watched more stuff, I reached the conclusion that, to me, the danger, if you will, is, for me personally, is more about, oh, I see, okay, like this is a rabbit hole of false beliefs, not substantiated by any evidence.
Yeah. Well, which you could say about any religion, right? And so it's a similar thing that you could say about religions, because they're and particularly things like Scientology, but even Christianity, there are ministers that will say in a sermon that mainstream psychology is not going to help you, and God will save you. God will cure your cancer. That's a very common thing that you hear from, not all ministers, but many ministers will say, I can cure your dementia. I can cure your cancer. I can cure your depression. I can cure
if you go evangelical, it's all of the above. Like, absolutely.
So the same problems, well, even other kinds of people, like people in the gray zone, the Tony Robbins people, or even people in my field, therapists that will claim that all of your emotional problems, your sleep problems, your stress problems, your eczema problems, your immune system problems are due to polyvagal theory, which I have studied to some extent. People want me to talk about it. I'll give a very brief sentence about this, which is that there's a lot of pseudoscience around the polyvagal theory. I think there's obviously some truth to it, but it's so the same kind of accusations that people are waging, including myself, against Teal Swan are applicable to literally millions of other completely seemingly legitimized professions and helpers in our society.
That's right. So I was saying that to agree with your point early, that I don't think that in of itself is exclusively or uniquely dangerous. I just look at it like all of that, to me, poses some amount of danger to society, because it is what leads us down the path of not being able to talk about things factually.
Yeah. And I think she gets targeted, and people like her, because she's not considered to be a legitimate religion, and so thus she's a lightning rod for all of that raging, and she's a woman, and a younger woman, and she is on the internet, so, and she doesn't act like a super guru. Like if she were to meditate all day and talk very little, and she didn't take selfies, I think there would be less attacks for her. Not that it's not warranted, but I think if you're going to attack her, then, well, let's attack all of that stuff, because like I said, there's millions of them, and they all need to be called into question. And I bet you a lot of people who attack her go to church on Sunday and hear the exact same thing packaged in a completely different package.
That's true. Now, there is this added dimension, and again, referencing the landmark thing, because there is something traumatizing when you're in an audience that you don't know. All these people are strangers. You just met them like an hour ago or whatever. And they're going up on stage and revealing these super personal, very traumatic things about themselves. I found it traumatizing to me, let alone to the person on stage, let alone potentially to others. And it's not well handled from my perspective, right? The accusations and the evidence I did see about implanted memories, that to me was the biggest red flag.
Yeah. And again, run of the mill. And people in my field are notorious in the 80s and 90s, continuing today. Very few of us do it today. But the implanted false memories, that's my people thing. So what she is doing is, again, extremely mundane. And she came from a therapist who helped her, who was notorious. Barbara Snow, who did that sort of stuff. So,
and by the way, I do believe she was abused sexually, though. There's so many signs from the interview. Like I heard a 3-hour interview with her childhood friend who believes that she's making most of it up, and yet tons of what she was saying, I was like, that's oh wow, that's not.
So I want to use this episode as like a primer, a primer.
Plant seeds everywhere.
So just to plant that seed is my initial take on hearing various different accounts, like what you're talking about, is that she, and this is a rough hypothesis that she was born with some organic brain issue. Similar to Chapman, actually. We heard a very similar thing. Like when she was very young, she hallucinated. She had thoughts about suicide. She felt very isolated and alone. Now, she would attribute it to her not being Mormon within a Mormon community, which I'm sure, probably had some oppressive bullying elements to it. But the pattern was of some level of delusion and hallucination and mild psychosis, mild thought disorder. Chapman, who killed John Lennon, would see these little people in the walls and that sort of thing. And she had a similar account. Now, she attributes it to being the fact that she is this unique being.
And she can see other dimensions and people's, what's she call it, auric fields? Yeah.
And that she's half alien and, these kinds of things. But anyway, and then the parents were concerned about that. And also, she probably had some other kinds of issues, some behavioral problems, because they were taking her from psychiatrist to psychologist. It's hard to know. The way Teal Swan says it is the parents were just misguided and didn't see her powers, didn't see her.
They were very science-based and didn't know how to handle a child with all these
which is powers. Why they took her to China to a Qigong specialist. That's how scientific they were. And so she was having some issues, and there's a lot of kids like this. Often these kids grow up to be what we might call schizotypal, which is they have a very odd, mild version of schizophrenia that is embedded in their personality, and it's not really related to what we might consider cycles of psychosis. It's more bipolar. It's more embedded in one's personality that you see magic everywhere, and you're so magical thinking that you actually will hallucinate. And the way that like little children, like if you're 3 and you are pretending or a common example is, by the way, if you're listening to this with little kids that still believe in Santa Claus, you might want to skip forward a few minutes. But you, as a child, you're 3 years old and the parents are like, Santa Claus, he's outside. And you run outside and see, there he is. And the kid could literally see Santa Claus. And if you ask the child the next day or the next year, have you ever seen Santa Claus? Yeah, I saw him. What do he look like? Well, he looked like this and this happened, this happened. And in one sense, you say, well, that's a hallucination. But in another sense, it's just the pliability of a young mind that is open to influence and also has a hard time differentiating reality from pretend.
Well, but in that case, it's because Santa is real. I mean, I have a security cam footage of him. So
yeah. So don't tell my mom either. She still believes. The way that I think it's schizotypal and adult magical thinking is it's that still retained either organically or developmentally due to trauma. You retain that inability to differentiate fiction from reality, but you don't have full-blown schizophrenia where you just have high levels of psychosis and hallucination, and it's not really, again, due to mood swings or fluctuations in brain chemistry. It's more just all the time.
I see.
And when you hear schizotypal people talk, they will often have very elaborate belief systems around the ability for them to cast spells and the ability that they can, Teal Swan says she can see your body. Right. She can read your blood. She can see your cellular structure. So I think that was present. It's hard to know. That's my initial hypothesis, is she had that. Now, if you're Teal Swan, you say, well, that's evidence of my special powers. Okay, whatever. But, clinically, we've seen that before. And I guess maybe Teal Swan would say they all have special powers. But anyway, then she is kind of abandoned by the parents because they are having so much difficulty, not only with that, but I think with other behavioral problems that I haven't heard any reports of, but it just sounds like that. Because if your kid's kind of odd and has an active imagination, you wouldn't, in a desperate act, take them to so many professionals before the age of 9 and also go to China in this desperate act of alternative psychology. And we also know that she had attempted suicide when she was a young child, which is very rare. It's common enough for teenagers to do it, but pre-12, pre-10, to attempt suicide, I mean, you are way at one end of the bell curve with that kind of behavior. It happens, but it's extremely rare. And so I'm guessing something was going on there. Then the parents, I think, pulled away. Maybe they had their own issues and maybe they abused her in some way. Who knows? And this other guy comes in.
Well, but that started at 6.
So they go to China when she's 5. And I think she's already attempted by that point, by the way. I don't know that. Don't quote me on that. Then she is basically handed over to this guy who says, I can fix her because I know quantum reality and all
Which,
stuff.
by the way, that part I don't believe, and there's no evidence that happened.
What
that
happened?
she was handed over to some quantum weirdo.
No, there's evidence. He even talked about, not that it was that she was completely in his custody,
Yeah.
but that he was often there to help her and spent a lot of time with her.
I mean, the way she describes it is that he would get her to lie to get out of school so he could rape her, basically.
And I don't know, I guess I'll maybe look into those details, but
Yeah.
everyone agrees, I think even the parents, that at some point this volunteer neighbor friend or something said, I can help. And who knows, this is just my running hypothesis. The parents just said, we don't know what to do and it's worth a try. And then Teal either does better because of this or is just out of the house.
The two things I was going on, and from my experience when I was little, that I thought, oh, wow, that sounds legit and not made up. One, when she was describing it, if you put aside all the supernatural stuff and all the extreme satanic cult stuff, if you just put all that aside, there were a lot of things that she was describing. Because the story she tells, there's no way a 6-year-old can remember all that stuff. There just isn't. Like, it's too many details, too many specifics. However, there were bits and pieces where I'm like, oh, that sounds so horribly familiar. That feeling, the way she described, and of course she could have practiced this, but it just felt too familiar. And then the thing that really did it for me is her friend who grew up with her, who doesn't believe probably 95% of the whole story. She was describing super precocious interactions related to porn and other very, very heavily sexual things at very young ages. And that I could also relate to. And I was like, oh yeah, that doesn't sound good. So all I believe is, I believe to some extent she was sexually abused.
Okay.
Beyond that,
Well, so then we hear that she goes into therapy at the age of, I don't know, it was somewhere around 20 or something, with a renowned implanter of satanic ritual abuse allegations. And she is well known to the authorities as someone who is a quack and does this and has done this with, and just imagine all the clients that she had done it to that didn't involve the police.
look, if you had asked me, I don't know, 20 years ago or something, I would have probably said like, oh, I could never fall for something like that. Now, knowing what I know now about myself, psychology, other things, I could see myself like at 20 going to the right or wrong kind of therapist, sitting there, and then, because I would remember what I did remember, right? Mm-hmm. And that would be the entry point. Mm-hmm. From there, it's like, well, do you realize think about her family. What was her family doing? Mm-hmm. And then I start thinking, well, I have this memory. And then I'd start saying these things are real. So I'd start saying, when I was a kid, I would sometimes feel like this purple goo pushing up against me, and it was kind of like a panicky feeling. Well, that's very common, and in fact what that usually means is that you're being bloodlet. But what? Dude, I could totally see it.
Yeah, especially if you lead someone down the road slowly.
Yeah.
And there are legit traumas there that are not readily accessible, but eventually accessible, not like repressed memories, but the traumatized individual just doesn't want to remember those things, and so it takes a little bit to get there.
Yeah.
And then you realize, oh, there's more to this story. I wonder what more there is to this story.
And by the way, when you're traumatized, you always want answers.
Yeah.
You want why. Even if you're not literally asking the question, your mind wants this why. So it must feel refreshing in a weird, dark way.
Yeah.
To get a why.
Yeah.
Well, they were Satan worship.
Right. Such a definitive why.
Yeah.
It's not that he was just kind of a pedophile. It was this vast conspiracy that's been ongoing. And if you're a magical thinker, you're probably open to this as well. So I don't know, but it sounds like those memories were implanted, and it did feel helpful to her somehow. She felt validated. It was a good relationship. She said that Barbara Snow was the first therapist that cried when she talked about her traumas, and she felt very validated by that. So I'm guessing Barbara Snow on some level was helpful, and she claims to have been a international model or something.
I did hear that, yes.
and she says that she started to go to this one like new agey shop, and then started to actually get into the sort of traditions that she was learning, and then became instantly one of the teachers in this community, and then, rose to prominence from there.
Because in that same podcast or whatever where the friend was talking, one of the things that was odd to them, and I certainly found it odd, was that I forget what the age was, but there was an age where supposedly Teal was traveling internationally or whatever for modeling and doing this other thing and going to school and leaving at 3 a.m. every night to go to satanic rituals and coming back in time for school every morning. And it was like, wow, that's a lot to do.
Well, multidimensional.
Yeah. So there was that. But at the same time, another thing that I found sort of telling that there is more to any story is that when in the documentary, do you remember the moment where one of the participants says that, and then I would go to these family gatherings and they would light up a fire and they would put the kids on the fire. Mm-hmm. Teal told almost the same story from her memories.
Yeah. Well, the stories are very similar because the implanters have a narrative in their mind that they think is like Barbara Snow. I don't know, but they almost always, in my estimation, they believe they are actually uncovering real memories. They're not maliciously.
Absolutely.
So they think they think it's not every child is a unique, abuse victim. They think every child they come into contact with is yet another victim of the same
ring of this.
Yeah.
And so therefore, that's what they do. They put children on.
So all their stories tend to be the same.
Yeah.
And now, if you just stop the story at that point, I would say this individual was born with a condition that some kids will have, and it does cause a lot of suffering, a lot of alienation, a lot of confusion for the parents, a lot of behavioral problems. And I feel really bad for her. I feel really bad for her family. It resulted in her being an easy victim, a vulnerable victim, because the family just didn't know what to do. Someone came in, abused her. Then a predatory therapist implanted some memories, but also was kind of helpful. And she never went to the police, or they did go to the police, but they decided not to prosecute because it was another one of Barbara Snow's clients making these outlandish claims with no data to back it up. And then she tries to find a career. She's very suicidal, but she manages to get through that. And now she's becoming a helper. Yeah. She's becoming someone who can help people with their issues. I would say good for her. Like, what a story of survival. There's some bumps in the road, but how can you blame her?
Right. And by the way, she is so articulate and comes off so smart. And so why not have such a career, putting your powers to good use?
Yeah. I mean,
your real powers.
Your intelligence, your empathy, your own experience with suicide and depression and demoralization and bullying and being abused. Like, what a great story.
Yeah.
And to some extent, that is still the narrative. But then we look at the organization that she builds and the many people that I will eventually look into in terms of the harm that was created by that. So that's my initial hypothesis. All right, well, this is taking too long. So let's break this up. Let's break this up into 2 episodes. Okay. So everyone out there, tune in next time when we continue the conversation, and take care of yourself because
you deserve it.